Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're plunging into a topic with, well, a really long and varied history. Induced abortion.
Absolutely. It stretches way back across so many cultures and time periods, the deliberate termination of pregnancy.
And the source material we've gathered for this deep dive is, frankly, fascinating. We've got historical summaries, legal texts, cultural observations.
A real mix. It gives us different angles, the broad sweep, the specific rules, and, how societies actually felt about it.
Exactly. Our mission today is to unpack that history. We want to look at the methods people used, the laws they created, and how attitudes towards abortion have shifted over time.
Think of it as a way to get up to speed quickly but thoroughly. We'll hit the key points, maybe some surprising facts, without getting bogged down.
Right. Clear, engaging, multiple perspectives. Okay, let's jump right into the pre-modern era. Where do we start?
Well, it's amazing how diverse the approaches were even back then. Take ancient India, for example. The Vedic and Smriti laws, they show this real concern for preserving the male line, especially in upper castes.
So there were consequences.
Oh, yes. Penalties for women who had abortions, even excommunication for priests who helped. But then the Ramayana mentions barber surgeons performing them.
Barber surgeons. Interesting. So maybe more common than the official laws suggest.
Quite possibly. It points to a practical reality alongside the religious or legal stance.
And then there's Assyria, around 1075 BCE. That law stands out.
It really does. The death penalty. It's the only ancient law we found mandating that.
But with a crucial catch, right?
Exactly. Only if the woman had the abortion against her husband's wishes.
Which tells you a lot about power dynamics back then. Women's agency, not so much.
Precisely. It frames it as a crime against the husband, his authority, not necessarily against a fetus itself.
And where's the earliest actual record of induced abortion?
That takes us to ancient Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, roughly 1550 BCE.
Wow, okay. So this goes back a very, very long way.
Deep roots, definitely.
Now, the methods they used early on, it sounds like surgery wasn't the main thing.
Not at all. Overwhelmingly non-surgical. We're talking really strenuous physical activity.
Like what?
Hard labor, climbing, paddling boats, lifting heavy weights, diving, things that would put immense strain on the body.
Almost trying to physically dislodge the pregnancy.
That seems to be the idea. Plus, using irritant leaves applied to the body, fasting, bloodletting, hot water on the abdomen.
And lying on heated coconut shells. That's incredibly specific.
It is. It really shows this process of observation, experimentation, maybe adapting things they knew from childbirth. Resourcefulness, really.
And these physical methods stuck around for a while.
They really did. Even into the early modern period in England, things like excessive exercise or wearing very tight girdles were still mentioned.
What about actual surgical attempts? Did those happen early on?
There's some archaeological hints, yeah. Suggestions of early surgical extractions.
Probably not common.
Likely very uncommon and incredibly risky, obviously, without modern understanding of anatomy, infection control, all of that.
Makes sense. So mostly physical methods and, I assume, plants, herbs.
Exactly. An 8th century Sanskrit text, for instance, gives instructions involving sitting over steam or stewed onions.
Stewed onions. Right. Doesn't sound pleasant.
Probably not. And in Southeast Asia, there was massage abortion.
How did that work?
Applying specific foam pressure to the abdomen. It was practiced for centuries. There's even a depiction at Angkor Wat.
Really? From when?
Around 1150 CE, a bas-relief showing what looks like a demon performing this kind of massage abortion. It's quite stark.
Wow. So it was embedded in their cultural imagery. What about Japan?
We see records starting in the 12th century, but it seems to have become much more common during the Edo period.
Why then?
That was a tough time. Famine, high taxes, especially for peasants. Abortion likely became a way to manage family size when resources were scarce.
And they have those Jizo statues. Right.
Yes, starting around 1710, maybe earlier. Statues of Jizo, the protector of children. They weren't just for abortions, but also for miscarriages, stillbirths, children who died young, a way of acknowledging and mourning those losses.
That's quite poignant. Okay, let's shift focus. The Maori in New Zealand.
Their methods included drugs to induce miscarriage, certain ceremonial practices, and also abdominal girding, like those tight belts.
But there was some conflicting information.
Yeah, one source suggests they might have focused more on inducing premature labor rather than a full abortion, possibly out of fear of Makutu harmful sorcery.
So cultural beliefs played a huge role in the specifics of the practice.
Absolutely. Shaping not just the methods, but the very perception of what was being done.
Okay, let's move to the Greco-Roman world. We have a lot more written sources there, don't we?
We do, mainly from classical texts. And it's interesting who is doing the work. Gynecology wasn't really a specialized physician thing yet.
So who handled it?
Primarily midwives, or sometimes just knowledgeable lay people. Plato actually mentions midwives inducing early abortions in one of his dialogues.
Was it generally illegal in ancient Greece?
The prevailing view is probably not punished by law, no, but there's a fragment from Lysias.
Yeah, suggesting a complication.
Right. It suggests that if a pregnant woman died from an abortion, it could be a crime against her husband. Why? Because the unborn child might have stood to inherit his estate.
So again, it's tied to property and the husband's rights, not necessarily the fetus's status.
Seems that way. Less about the morality of ending the pregnancy, more about inheritance lines.
And they had specific substances they used. I remember reading about silphium.
Oh, silphium, yes. A famous herb from Cyrene, used as both an abortifacient and a contraceptive.
It was a big deal economically, wasn't it?
Huge. Their main export. They even put it on their coins. But then it went extinct.
Riven extinct, wow. Over-harvesting, maybe.
That's the theory. A cautionary tale. And it makes you wonder about its relatives still around today.
Definitely. What about the Romans? Did they have their go-to herbs?
They did. Pliny the Elder, 1st century CE, he thought refined oil of common rue was particularly potent.
Rue? Okay.
And Serenus Simonicus gave a recipe: rue, egg, and dill. It wasn't just folk knowledge either.
Yeah.
Big names like Cyrannus, Dioscorides, or Abasius, they all wrote about using rue.
And modern science backs this up.
It does. Studies have found compounds in rue that can induce abortion. So there was something to it.
Were there others besides rue?
Yes, birthwort was another one, used both to ease childbirth and induce abortion. Galen put it in potions. Dioscorides suggested taking it orally or as a vaginal pessary with pepper and myrrh.
And even playwrights mention these things.
Aristophanes, way back in 421 BCE, made a joke about pennyroyal's abortifacient properties in one of his plays, so it was known in popular culture too.
What about Hippocrates, the famous physician?
Well, there's the story of him advising a prostitute to jump up and down in a certain way to cause a miscarriage.
Jump.
Apparently so. But writings attributed to him also describe instruments, things for dilating the cervix and scraping the uterus curettage.
So some understanding of surgical approaches even then.
Some early understanding, yes, though maybe not widely practiced.
Who offered more detail on methods?
Cyrannus, in the 2nd century CE. He's a key source. He actually advocated for what he saw as safer methods first.
Like what?
Diuretics, things to provoke menstruation, emmenagogues, enemas, fasting, bloodletting. He was wary of sharp instruments. Fear of perforating the uterus, a major danger. So he preferred energetic walking, carrying heavy loads, riding animals.
And the Lacedaemonian leap, what's that?
Apparently jumping in the air trying to kick your own buttocks with your heels sounds strenuous.
No kidding. Did he have recipes too?
Yes, for herbal baths, rubs, pessaries. And Dioscorides mentioned an abortion wine.
Made from?
Hellebore squirting cucumber and scammony. Though the exact preparation isn't clear, hellebore itself was known to be an abortifacient.
It's fascinating that Tertullian, a Christian writer, describes surgical tools.
It is quite remarkable. 2nd, 3rd century CE, he talks about a flexible frame for dilation, a ring-shaped blade for scraping, a hook maybe blunted or covered for extraction, even a copper needle or spike.
Sounds surprisingly like modern D&E tools.
Very similar concepts, and he attributed them to famous physicians like Hippocrates and Cyrannus.
And Celsus, the Roman encyclopedist.
He wrote a detailed procedure in De Medicina for removing a dead fetus. So clearly, managing complicated pregnancies was part of medical practice.
We also heard about women binding themselves tightly.
Yes, Hippolytus of Rome wrote about that in the 3rd century CE. Trying to physically expel the fetus shows the lengths women might go to.
So these natural abortifacients were just everywhere in the pre-modern world.
Or much standard tools, yeah. Mentioned in classical literature, part of folk medicine traditions.
But effectiveness varied wildly, I imagine, and safety.
Huge variation, and definitely risky. Some of these plants were outright poisonous if used incorrectly or in the wrong dose.
What are some examples from later periods, say medieval times?
Well, an 11th century herbal, De Viribus Herbarum, lists quite a few. Rue, Italian catnip, savory, sage, soapwort, different kinds of hellebore, pennyroyal.
And Islamic physicians?
They also documented using abortifacients. They even commented on how well they worked or didn't and how common they were.
It's almost jarring to find Benjamin Franklin including a recipe in a math textbook in colonial America.
Right, but he framed it as a solution for unmarried women, suggesting it was, a known issue and people were looking for solutions following European traditions.
And even in 1898, a medical text recommended pennyroyal tea as safe and certain.
Yeah, the King's American Dispensatory, which is terrifying in hindsight.
Because pennyroyal is not safe.
Absolutely not. We know now it can cause severe complications, liver damage, even death. There are documented cases from as recently as the 1970s and 90s, a stark warning about historical remedies.
What other plants kept popping up?
Tansy has a really long history, thousands of years, used early in pregnancy to restore menstruation. St. Hildegard of Bingen wrote about it.
And 7.
That's a type of juniper. Comes up a lot in European sources. There are even records of people buying it in 16th century England.
Were there non-plant substances too?
Oh yeah. Things like Spanish fly, which is toxic opium, even chemicals like iron sulfate or iron chloride in England. Really harsh stuff.
It wasn't always about inducing abortion, though, was it? Sometimes about dealing with a miscarriage.
Right, like that mixture for a missed abortion with dittany and hyssop suggests a more nuanced understanding of different pregnancy outcomes.
And on the continent.
Worm fern root, sometimes called prostitute root in French, was used. A Greek physician mentioned it way back in the 1st century. German folk medicine had teas with marjoram, thyme, parsley.
And then the really weird stuff.
Crushed ants, camel saliva, deer tail hairs, and bear fat. It really shows the range of experimentation, maybe desperation sometimes.
Let's talk attitudes. How did different philosophies view abortion?
The Stoics. They had a distinct view. Fetus as plant-like until birth and the first breath. Then it becomes an animal. So, before birth, abortion wasn't a major moral issue for them.
Aristotle was different, though.
Yes, he made a distinction based on whether the fetus had sensation and being alive. Before that stage, he didn't see it as killing a human.
He even had timelines for ensoulment, right?
He did, based on observation, 40 days for males, 90 for females, he thought. Before the human soul, it had vegetable and animal souls. It's quite a specific framework.
What about the Hippocratic Oath? I will not give a pessary to cause abortion.
That line is famous, but modern scholars debate its original meaning.
How so?
Some argue it was specifically about pessaries because they often cause dangerous vaginal ulcers, not necessarily a ban on all abortion.
Like the Oath's original stance against surgery, which was also very risky back then.
Exactly. Others interpret it more broadly, of course. Scribonius Largus did. But it might have been about discouraging specific dangerous methods.
Soranus acknowledged this difference in opinion among doctors.
He did. He said there were two groups, those following Hippocrates strictly, and his own party, who saw abortion as acceptable sometimes.
Under what circumstances?
He mentioned risks to the woman's health or even her emotional immaturity as valid reasons in his work, Gynecology.
How does Roman law handle it, generally?
In the Republic and early empire, it was mostly about the father's rights, paterfamilias. Abortion wasn't punished as homicide unless it violated his authority over potential offspring.
So the Stoic view maybe influenced that. Fetus not seen as a full person.
Likely contributed, yes. And interestingly, if a couple divorced, the woman could choose abortion because the embryo was seen as, quote, part of the mother's own organs.
But that changed later.
It did. Around 211 AD, Emperors Septimius Severus and Caracalla banned it, calling it an infringement on parental rights. Punishment was temporary exile, a shift towards state interest.
There was also that 3rd century text, Poli Sententiae.
Right, outlining punishments for giving abortifacients. Exile or mines, depending on social class. But the death penalty only if the woman died from taking it. Again, focus on harm to her.
And the jurist Ulpian.
His famous line in the Digest, an unborn child is considered being born as far as it concerns his profits, but that was mainly about inheritance law.
So even with some legal recognition, abortion was still common.
Seems so. Practiced with little or no sense of shame, according to historical accounts.
Let's shift to early Christian perspectives. How do they interpret relevant Old Testament passages? Exodus 21.22.
That's the one about men fighting and accidentally causing a woman to miscarry. The penalty is just a fine if she's otherwise unharmed, but life for life if she is harmed.
How is that interpreted?
Well, some commentators argue it shows the fetus wasn't valued as equal to the woman's life, didn't have a soul yet in that view. Others strongly disagree. Like C. Everett Koop, it's debated.
And the ordeal of the bitter water in Numbers 5.
Where the unfaithful wife drinks special water that causes a miscarriage if she's guilty. Some have controversially used that to suggest divine approval in certain cases. Highly debated, obviously.
What about early, explicit Christian writings?
The Didache, very early, maybe before 100 AD, clearly says, "Do not murder a child by abortion or kill a newborn infant." A clear moral stance.
Tertullian had a specific exception.
Yes, only if the fetus was in an abnormal position that endangered the woman's life during childbirth. A very narrow exception.
St. Augustine.
Yeah.
He was hugely influential.
He was. He acknowledged surgical removal of dead fetuses. He believed aborting a fetus animatus, one with recognizable human form, was murder.
What about earlier stages?
More like Aristotle's view. He wasn't sure about the status of unformed fetuses, even wondered if they'd be resurrected. But he was adamant that surgically removing parts of a fetus to save the mother was not denying life to something already living.
Moving into the medieval period, the Liges Henrici I in England.
Around 1115. It set compensation if someone caused a miscarriage, and penance for a woman inducing her own abortion. Interestingly, the penance depended on quickening.
Quickening, that first fetal movement.
Right. Believed to be when the soul entered ensoulment or animation, longer penance after quickening, shorter before, but only if the abortion was to hide illicit sex.
And the connection to witchcraft.
Midwives performing abortions were sometimes accused, yeah. Mentioned in the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487, combining forbidden medicine with perceived evil.
There was a key papal decree in 1591.
Yes, Pope Gregory XIV's Sedes Apostolica. It limited the severe canonical punishments, like irregularity for clerics, to abortions of a formed fetus. Early abortion of an inanimate or soulless fetus wasn't considered true homicide in that context.
So a distinction based on development similar to Aristotle and Augustine.
Exactly. That distinction held in canon law for centuries.
Until when?
Until Pope Pius IX in 1869. His Apostolicae Sedis Moderatione removed that distinction regarding excommunication. Automatic excommunication for procuring an abortion at any stage of pregnancy. A much stricter uniform stance.
Which is closer to the current Catholic and Eastern Orthodox position.
Yes. Opposing abortion from conception.
How did Jewish tradition generally view it?
From biblical times, often more through a social or ethical lens than strictly theological. The mother's life and health consistently take precedence.
Okay. So a huge range of views over centuries. Let's move into the modern era. For the 19th century saw a big shift towards criminalization, didn't it?
A massive shift, yes. Especially in the English-speaking world, it coincided with big medical advances, surgery getting safer, anesthesia, better sanitation.
But also a backlash against women's rights.
That seems to be part of the context. Before this, remember, early-term abortion before quickening was widely practiced and generally legal under common law. Criminalization was a relatively new thing.
What drove the change? Who was pushing for it?
In the U.S., physicians were major advocates. They argued new medical understanding showed quickening wasn't some magical dividing line. Development was a continuum.
So if abortion after quickening was wrong, why not before?
That was the medical logic presented. But there are practical reasons, too.
Right.
Professionalization. Many abortion providers weren't formally trained doctors, not part of the medical societies. The established physicians saw them as irregulars, maybe a public health risk, but also competition.
Right. Undercutting their authority and fees?
That was certainly part of it. They wanted medicine to be their domain.
When did the laws start changing in England?
The first big one was Lord Ellenborough's Act in 1803, first law to explicitly outlaw abortion.
With harsh penalties.
Very. Death penalty if done after quickening, transportation for 14 years if before.
And the U.S. followed English common law initially.
Mostly, yes. So pre-quickening abortions were hard to regulate or prosecute. Often the mother's testimony about feeling movement was the only evidence.
But did the English laws get amended?
Yes. 1828 and 1837. They removed the quickening distinction and abolished the death penalty. But later in the century, punishments increased again, justified by claims that more married women were having abortions after 1840. And the 1861 Offenses Against the Person Act even made it a crime just to get the tools or poison for an abortion.
But even with stricter laws, it still happened.
Oh, definitely. Services were available in U.S. cities in the 1860s. Estimates were around 1 abortion for every 4 live births. High numbers.
When did U.S. states start passing their own specific anti-abortion laws?
Began in the 1820s. Connecticut targeted pharmacists selling abortion poisons in 1821. New York in 1829 made post-quickening a felony, pre-quickening a misdemeanor.
And it accelerated after the Civil War.
Massively. Legislators, doctors, the AMA pushing hard. Then the Comstock Law in 1873.
What did that do?
Banned making or distributing info about abortion, contraception, even preventing STDs, very broad censorship.
So by the early 20th century,
By 1910, pretty much all states had anti-abortion laws on the books, though how strictly they were enforced varied a lot.
looking at today, we see similar trends of restriction in some places.
Yes, globally, there's been a recent trend towards more restrictive laws, often using negative framing, and the U.S. debate is very polarized.
Life at conception versus bodily autonomy.
That's the core ideological clash often presented. And post-Dobbs, overturning Roe v. Wade, we've seen many U.S. states ban abortion, targeting providers heavily.
How does that affect doctors?
Big impact.
Yeah.
OBGYNs in states with bans face huge restrictions on offering care or even referrals, legal uncertainty, institutional roles. It really damages the doctor-patient relationship.
It's interesting to contrast that with France in the 19th century.
Right, initially seen as a last resort for unmarried women, but later, writers started framing it as family planning for married women, a solution for failed contraception.
Making it more acceptable.
More thinkable, as one source put it, especially as people, rightly or wrongly, started perceiving it as safer, whether done by doctors or not. Shows how social narratives can shift things.
Let's talk about the actual methods in the 19th and 20th centuries. You mentioned surgical abortion in 1800s. New York had a high death rate.
Shockingly high, around 30%. That definitely fueled the AMA's push for doctors to take control.
What was common later? Syracuse, 1870.
Flushing the uterus with injected water. Relatively cheap, too, $10 in installments.
Cheaper than in Britain.
Much cheaper. British providers in the 19th century might charge 10 to 50 guineas. A lot of money then.
In England, after 1870, fertility rates dropped. Was abortion part of that?
Possibly. Alongside withdrawal, abstinence, maybe early condoms, but unwanted pregnancies still happened. Abortifacients were advertised discreetly. Folk methods persisted.
What kind of things did working-class women use?
Harsh purgatives, pennyroyal, aloes, turpentine, hot baths with gin, extreme exercise, intentional falls, even veterinary drugs, desperate measures.
And backstreet abortions were dangerous?
Often fatal, yes. Estimates for illegal attempts in England in 1914 were huge, like 100,000, mostly using drugs.
There was that strange case in Sheffield with lead poisoning.
Yes, linked to lead water pipes causing miscarriages. Then women started intentionally using diachylon, a lead plaster, as an abortifacient, prevalent in the Midlands until WWI. Tragic.
And Spanish fly used in Canada?
Found in an abortionist's mix in Calgary in 1894. Very dangerous stuff.
The range of objects used for self-induction is horrifying.
It really is. Candles and whales in the 1920s, glass rods, pen holders, curling irons, spoons, knives, catheters in the 19th century U.S.
And the steam method persisted.
Jewish women on the Lower East Side of Manhattan were still using the ancient practice of sitting over steam in the early 20th century. Incredible continuity.
Was abortion still considered more dangerous than childbirth for a long time?
Some commentators argued yes until maybe 1930. Others felt early abortions by skilled midwives were relatively safe even in the 19th century.
But the illegal era, say from the 1930s until legalization, became particularly bad.
Yes, enforcement got stricter, organized crime got more involved, made it even riskier.
It's amazing that advertising continued despite the bans.
It really is. So much coded language in Victorian ads in the US, UK, Canada. Services, devices, medicines.
The British Medical Journal writer found most temporarily indisposed ads were for abortion,
Over half, he reckoned, in 1868, just hidden in plain sight.
with names like Catholic pills or woman's friend.
Exactly. Or French renovating pills. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, often containing pennyroyal tansy 7.
Marketed for female complaints or restoring regularity.
All euphemisms. Irregularity, obstruction, delayed period. Everyone knew what they meant. Some just claimed to regulate periods.
Even Beecham's pills, the laxative,
Ads link them to female ailments, subtly suggesting broader use.
and Madame Restell. She was infamous.
The female abortionist. Huge business across the northern U.S. for 40 years from the 1830s. Surgical and pills.
Spent a fortune on advertising.
Massive amounts. $60,000 a year by 1870. Restellism became a synonym for abortion.
Her ads were quite direct, almost challenging societal norms.
Yes, asking married women if they should just keep having children regardless of consequences, when a simple, easy, certain remedy exists. Sold female monthly regulating pills, too.
She faced criticism.
Constantly. In the press, arrested multiple times, eventually committed suicide after Anthony Comstock arrested her in 1878.
Comstock of the Comstock Law.
The very same anti-vice crusader.
So the advertising was seen as quackery, immoral.
Widely criticized, yes. Safety was dubious. Horace Greeley called abortionists a guild of professional murderers.
Did all newspapers take the ads?
No, Greeley's own Tribune refused them, but his Herald did accept them. Elizabeth Blackwell lamented female physician becoming linked to abortionist.
These ads sometimes had warnings against use during pregnancy.
Which was completely ironic, right? Listing miscarriage as a side effect was basically advertising the intended use.
Yeah.
Dr. Peter's French renovating pills, Fryer's French female regulator, all used this tactic.
And later, in the 1930s.
Pills like Molex and Cope marketed for delayed women, containing ergotin, aloes, black hellebore. The FTC eventually deemed them unsafe and ineffective in 1940.
This advertising seems to have been really effective, especially in the U.S.
Estimates suggest maybe 20–25% of pregnancies ended in abortion in the mid-19th century U.S., less so in Europe.
And who was getting abortions changed?
Yes. Before the 19th century, mostly unmarried women, but by the mid to late 19th century, medical journals showed over half were married women, many already had kids.
And the blame was often put on.
The women's rights movement, ironically enough, especially after the Civil War.
But many feminists of the time actually opposed abortion.
They did. Stanton and Anthony's paper, The Revolution, argued for fixing the root causes poverty, lack of education, male behavior, not just banning abortion. They saw the woman as awfully guilty, but the man who drove her to it equally so.
So they saw it as a consequence of male dominance.
Often, yes. Thoughtless men, marital rape, seduction, a result of women lacking control and respect.
Were socialist feminists different?
Generally more sympathetic to the need for abortion, especially for the poor. Some socialist feminist doctors like Marie Equi, Madeleine Pelletier, William J. Robinson even performed low-cost or free abortions.
When did the organized campaign for abortion law reform really start?
Took off in the 1920s and 30s, building on successes in the birth control movement.
People like Marie Stopes and Margaret Sanger.
Exactly. They brought birth control into the open, set up clinics. That paved the way for talking about abortion reform.
Was there early legal change in Britain?
The Infant Life Preservation Act of 1929, it clarified that abortion to save the mother's life wasn't a crime. A small but significant step.
Who was a key voice pushing for more?
Stella Brown, a major birth control campaigner who really focused on abortion rights in the 1930s.
What was her argument?
Influenced by sexologists, she argued working women needed the choice, given their harsh conditions, advocated free birth control, then explicitly argued for a woman's right to decide on abortion from 1931 onwards.
So you lectured on the dangers of denying choice.
Yes. Suicide, injury, illness, mental health issues, blood poisoning, framing it as a health and rights issue.
Then came the Bourne case in 1938.
Huge landmark. Dr. Alec Bourne, acquitted for aborting a rape victim, set the precedent that abortion was legal if pregnancy would make the woman a mental and physical wreck.
Were there similar figures or cases elsewhere? Dr. Stowe in Canada?
Yes, Emily Stowe, one of Canada's first female doctors, was tried for abortion back in the 19th century, shows the early struggle.
Other reformers joined the cause.
Frida Lasky, Dora Russell, Joan Mallison, Janet Chance, prominent feminists championing reform. The British Medical Association forming a committee in 1932 was a mainstream breakthrough.
And that led to ALRA.
The Abortion Law Reform Association, founded February 1936, first advocacy group specifically for liberalization in Britain, campaigned, educated, grew its membership.
They were involved in a public case.
Yes, their medico-legal committee handled the case of that 14-year-old rape victim who Dr. Joan Mallison helped get a termination. That brought publicity.
Joan Mallison was involved in the Bourne case, too.
She was the one who referred the girl to Dr. Bourne, a key connector.
Public interest faded with the war.
Yes. The initial momentum was interrupted. The Burkitt Committee recommended changes in 1939, but war put everything on hold.
And Dr. Morgentaler in Canada later.
He became famous, or infamous, for opening illegal clinics in Toronto, challenging the law directly.
Okay, let's look at the actual liberalization of laws in the 20th century. Canada.
Before 1969, it was a serious crime. Life imprisonment for the doctor. It stayed illegal until the Supreme Court struck down the law in 1988. Still debated, though.
Medication abortion wasn't common there initially.
Very low rates, 1–2% in 2008. Pills were legalized later, in 2017, controversially.
Russia was the first country to legalize.
First government, yes. 1920, the Russian Soviet Republic. Legalized on request, often free,
Why?
to stop dangerous illegal abortions by untrained babki, make it safe, medical, worked well in cities, less so in rural areas.
But then Stalin reversed it.
Yes, made illegal again 1936 and 1955, except for medical reasons. Worried about population decline, wanted to promote the family.
Spain had a brief period of legality.
During the Civil War in Catalonia, free abortion in the first 12 weeks, decreed late 1936, short-lived due to the war's outcome.
Back to Britain post-war.
ALRA kept campaigning. Social changes in the 60s brought it back to the forefront. John Peel from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists led the committee advising on the 1967 Act.
What did the 1967 Act do?
Legalized abortion on specific grounds, risk to women's physical or mental health, risk to existing children's health if under 28 weeks, or severe fetal handicap, provided free via the NHS. A major change.
What about the U.S. movement in the 60s?
It really gained steam. Groups like the Society for Humane Abortion provided information. Jerry Santoro's death from an illegal abortion in 1964 became a powerful symbol.
And groups like Jane in Chicago.
Yes, women's groups providing underground abortions themselves. Direct action.
Organizations formed on both sides.
Late 60s, yes. NARAL's forerunners started in 69, opposing restrictions. On the other side, groups formed to defend existing laws.
Did medical groups weigh in?
Yes, the AMA, ABA, AAP, state medical bar groups supported laws protecting doctors who performed abortions under controlled hospital settings, a shift towards regulated access.
Colorado was the first state to decriminalize.
In 1967, but narrowly only for rape, incest, or severe maternal disability.
California's 1967 Therapeutic Abortion Act was broader.
Broader, yes. Passed with bipartisan support despite Catholic opposition. Governor Reagan signed it, decriminalizing abortion to protect the mother's health.
Did it lead to more abortions?
Numbers soared, around 100,000 a year by the 70s, almost all applications approved. Coincided with feminism's rise and the idea of bodily control. Reagan later regretted signing it.
Hawaii went further in 1970.
First state to legalize abortion simply on the woman's request. New York repealed its old law, allowing abortion up to 24 weeks. Alaska, Washington followed with similar laws.
And the Vooch case clarified health.
Yes, Supreme Court in 1971 upheld the D.C. law allowing abortion for life or health, defining health broadly to include mental well-being. So, by late 72, a patchwork of laws existed.
Until Roe v. Wade in 1973.
The big one. Supreme Court struck down the Texas ban, establishing a constitutional right to privacy that included abortion.
How did it structure that right?
Tied it to pregnancy trimesters? States couldn't interfere much in the first trimester, could regulate for maternal health in the second, could prohibit in the third after viability, except to save the mother's life or health, nullified conflicting state laws nationwide.
And this became a unifying issue for feminists.
Absolutely. From the 70s on, abortion and reproductive rights were central to second-wave feminism globally.
Until Dobbs overturned Roe in 2022.
Right. June 24th, 2022. The Dobbs v. Jackson decision eliminated the federal constitutional right, returning regulation entirely to the states, also overturned Planned Parenthood v. Casey, a massive reversal.
Let's quickly touch on the development of the actual methods used today, the curette.
Prototypes existed anciently, but the modern design is French, 1723. First used in gynecology, 1842. D&C standard from late 19th century.
Vacuum aspiration.
First described by James Young Simpson in the 19th century. Led to suction aspiration, improved by Bykov in Russia, 1927. Used in Asia before the West in the 60s.
The Carmen cannula was an improvement.
Big one, 1970s. Flexible plastic, less perforation risk, allowed local anesthesia often.
And the feminist self-help device, the Del-M.
Invented 1971. Safe, cheap suction for very early abortions, menstrual extraction, usable by people with minimal training, empowering access.
What about abortion pills?
Research started in Sweden, 1965. Early trials failed. Later focus on prostaglandins, Nobel Prize work in 82.
So medication abortion developed alongside surgical.
Yes, using prostaglandin analogs in the 70s, like carboprost trialed in the U.S. in 79.
But mifepristone was the big breakthrough.
RU486, yes, developed by Roussel Uclaf in France, 1981. An antiprogestogen, usually used with misoprostol. Approved French China 88, U.S. 2000, many others since.
There's also intact dilation and extraction.
Developed by Dr. McMahon, 1983. Resembles some 19th century procedures for obstructed labor involving skull collapse. controversial.
And manual vacuum aspiration came back.
Renewed interest in the U.S. mid-90s. For very early abortions, right after a positive test, Dr. Edwards developed a protocol using a handheld syringe.
And today, globally,
Medication abortions are now more common than surgical ones, generally speaking. A major shift.
looking around the world, bans often lead to unsafe abortions.
Historically, yes, or reproductive tourism. Asia has a tragically high share of unsafe abortion deaths, though some argue illegality didn't always mean unsafe, like with skilled midwives in the 19th century. U.S.-China's policy shifted back and forth.
Illegal early 50s, pro-growth, then relaxed for safety and population control. Uses contraception back up in the 80s. Laws later tried to curb sex-selective abortions, had high numbers, but Russia had a higher rate for a while.
India criminalized it for over a century.
1860-1971, led to many deaths from unsafe providers. Legalized in 71 under certain conditions, but safe access is still a huge issue, especially for poorer women. Iran reported high numbers recently, too.
Japan is known for acceptance.
Since legalization in 1948, numbers peaked mid-century, declined with contraception access, law initially linked to eugenics, then economic welfare, partner consent sometimes still needed. Conservative opposition failed to restrict access significantly.
Romania's story is particularly stark.
Legal, 1957, then criminalized by Ceausescu in 66 to boost birth rates. Decree 770, horrific results. Thousands died from illegal abortions, huge numbers of abandoned children. Legalized again immediately after the revolution in 89.
Thailand had intense debates.
80s, 90s. Opponents framed it as un-Buddhist Western corruption. Legalized 2006 for rape, fetal impairment, mental health factors. But strict rules mean many still seek unsafe illegal abortions, especially the poor. So wrapping this up, the key takeaway seems to be complexity.
Absolutely. This history is so multifaceted. It's about medicine, law, social norms, religion, women's agency, all changing and interacting across time and place.
Something that really stands out is just the sheer persistence, the drive to control reproduction, using whatever means available.
From ancient herbs and desperate physical measures to sophisticated pills and coded Victorian ads, that thread runs right through, the desire for control.
And looking at this long history, it really forces us to confront the questions we still grapple with today, doesn't it?
It does. The ongoing debates about access, regulation. What does this history teach us about that tension?
The tension between individual rights, societal values, the role of the state in these deeply personal decisions.
Exactly. It's a history that doesn't offer easy answers, but it gives incredible context for the discussions happening right now.
Hopefully, this deep dive gives our listeners a solid foundation to think more about those enduring questions.
We hope so. Plenty more to explore based on what we've covered today.